Sorry, I thought it was. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. I was temporarily muted. I'm sorry. Um, okay, let me just do that again. All right. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk about the City of Davis's South Fork Preserve. I was I've been a long-term volunteer for the City of Davis and for Putah Creek Council, and it's nice that the pandemic starting to recede. I actually can actually get out there and lead some more walks. I've led a number of walks at the South Fork Preserve. I've also led some walks out at Audubon's Bobcat Ranch over the years. But I really like the South Fork Preserve, and if you haven't had a chance to visit it, do so. This presentation hopefully will get you a little more inspired to go out there and visit it, and also to appreciate some of the successful conservation that's gone on with Putah Creek as well as the South Fork Preserve. I think the South Fork is one of some of the nicest riparian vegetation along the creek, and Putah Creek itself is just a real ecological treasure for Yolo, Solano County, the Sacramento region. Audubon's actually been involved in this project in several ways. One, Yolo Audubon, two members of Yolo Audubon early on helped start Putah Creek Council, and I'll tell you a little bit more about um, their work along the creek. And Audubon, California has been involved in working with the city of Davis to do some restoration down a little downstream of the reserve on the Los Rios property. So let me tell you a little bit more about where this place is. So on the screen here, you've got the gray area, City of Davis. You've got I-80 crossing from lower left to upper right. And if you go out to the east side of town, down Mace Boulevard, you drive down Mace Boulevard until you actually cross the creek. It's about 2.5 miles south of I-80, Mace Boulevard, or the Mace interchange. Um, and it's about it's a city-owned property. It's one of the several city-owned open space areas around town. This is the first open space area the city purchased, and it's the largest. A little quick aside, I wanted to tell you about the city's open space program because they're the ones that have done so much investing of public money in this reserve. The city open space program is funded by a parcel tax called Measure O that was passed in 2000 by over 70% of the voters. And it's provided a reliable source of funding for the city to leverage with they have other funds within the city, but they also leverage it with state and federal dollars. And since that measure has been that parcel tax has been in place, the city's been able to actually match $1 of its money to $4 of the state and federal funding. It's just incredible leverage that they've been able to do. And they've protected around 5,000 acres of land around the city. This map here shows some of the areas in dark green that the city owns. They're not necessarily all open space properties, but a number of them are. The areas with hatches are easements. Uh, the city, some of the lighter green areas are projects that the city has worked with other nonprofit organizations. So there's a lot of conservation activity. The the South Fork Preserve is open year round. It's publicly accessible, and there are trails. Here's a close up of the preserve itself. You can see running north south from the top to the bottom is Mace Boulevard. The left side is Solano County, and the right side is Yolo County. But Putah Creek flows right through the middle of this property. And there are a variety of trails that have been put in. The orange areas are some open farm roads that give you a little more room to walk side by side. The Dashed line across on the southern side of the creek is a single track trail. And over on the left side, right next near the highway, is a parking lot, a kiosk with some interpretive information. There's an educational area, and there's just recently opened up this year in May is a new handicap accessible trail that leads you right down to an observation deck at the creek, and it's just a beautiful observation deck. The little black asterisks show where there's interpretive signs that have been put in just this past year, and they really help tell the story of a lot of what I'm going to summarize tonight. Over on the west side of the property, there is a more of a primitive trail that goes down onto the lower floodplain areas of the creek, and that is a trail that was just that property over there, 10 acres, was purchased just about 6 or 7 years ago. The preserve itself has several different habitats. In terms of upland habitats, there's some great riparian habitat. For a lot of you birders, you know that riparian is one of the richest habitats for breeding and wintering birds in California. A number of you may not appreciate that riparian, about 95% of the riparian habitat in California has actually been converted to a lot of agriculture as well as urban areas. So it leaves these, let me step back a little bit here. It leaves much of the riparian now is, hold on, I think I got one slide out of place here, but this is the new path that just before we actually finish it, this is the new wheelchair accessible path through the riparian area. This is the observation deck that is now out there on the creek over a large wide area in the creek. That a lot of these new improvements have been put in by both contractors as well as volunteers. And here's this grid that we're putting in to make sure it's wheelchair accessible. And these are some of the interpretive signs that have been put in multiple places along the creek. There's a single track trail that walks you through several parts of the creek. This is near one of, I think it's a big walnut tree that's out there. So here's what I was going to say earlier is that the riparian habitat has been substantially lost, leaving these narrow strips of vegetation along the creek. Here's an aerial view just below Davis of Putah Creek, and you can see it's just a thin little strip of trees in an area that's mostly farmed. So it makes this preserve a real special habitat to have that riparian still existing. The preserve also has some more upland areas. This is some meadows areas just a little further away from the creek. And then there is a restored oak woodland that's been planted out there. This particular scene here 30 years ago was a tomato field, and now we have a really nice oak woodland. In addition to those upland habitats, there are some two major kinds of aquatic habitats. There are these wide pond areas in the preserve as well as up and down the creek. And we've seen otters swimming around in there. This is a great spot for egrets and shorebirds, depending on the level of the water in the creek. In other places, there's fairly narrow channels that you have trees arching over the water, providing some cooler shaded habitat for fish. One of the things that I enjoy about part of this creek, I was out there after some of the first rains one season, and the rains were washing all the tannins from the oak leaves into the creek, and the creek water turned black, just like tea water, basically. And it's just an interesting phenomena of what happens along the creek. During the during major storms, this area is very much a floodway. This is a picture from 2019 of the Mace Boulevard Bridge. And the waters during that, when the glory hole up at Lake Berryessa was spilling, the waters came within a few feet of the bottom of that bridge. The lower picture is looking across from the outer levees towards the creek itself and just completely underwater. I went out to that spot about 5 months after the rain, and I got this picture. This is the bathtub ring. The water stood in this area for so long that the clay particles from the water adhered to the trees and created this bathtub ring throughout the forest. That coloration lasted actually for about a year and a half or so before it finally started washing off. This area is getting better and better known, and it's pretty well used. This was a Sunday at the creek. I was down there last fall on a Sunday, and I got these great pictures. There's a kid playing with a crayfish. On the upper right, there's actually a young woman who sells jewelry in town, and she wanted to use it as a photo shoot to advertise her jewelry. The lower left, there's a UC Davis class that was out there doing some aquatic sampling. And then there was families walking around. So it's used by a lot of different kinds of people. From young people, like this was a Girl Scout troop that I brought out there. And they're all showing off their little duck decoys, or mini duck decoys that we made out of just some tules that I had out there. It's also very accessible. Now that there's a great trail out there, it's very accessible for older people. This is a picture of 4 of my neighbors. All of them are around 85 years old. And they were able to walk out to this, to the observation deck and enjoy it. One of my neighbors has an artificial leg. And they're all able to get out there on their own power. And it's just really great to see the whole variety of people using this area. Some of my favorite things about the preserve are, one, the monster trees that are out there. You just can't believe it. If you think about the history of this landscape that's gone on. On the left side is a Fremont cottonwood that's 18 and a half feet around. It's probably 150 years old. The upper right, a California black walnut I found out there, 20 feet across. Okay, it has a couple of different trunks, but it's still pretty big. And then the lower right, this is a little bit upstream of the preserve, but there's this red willow that we found while we were canoeing out there. And in this picture, I have some friends. I have Tracy Reynolds, who was the city open space program. I have people from Tree Davis and Putah Creek Council in this picture. Another fun feature that I really like about this is on the upstream part of it is a living willow bridge. This is a tree that has fallen down across the creek, and it's rooted on both sides of the creek now. Some of the branches have actually gone down to the ground, and it has this sprouting of willow branches if the beavers don't get to it. Sometimes the beavers can really take it down pretty seriously, but it's a great willow bridge. Also want to give you a little bit of idea of the watershed context of the preserve. This is a map you can see on the right here, Sacramento. There's Davis. This is the South Fork Preserve down here. You go upstream to Winters, and this is this large blue outlined area is the watershed for Putah Creek. Includes Lake Berryessa. It actually starts way up by Cobb Mountain, just south of Clear Lake, about 85 miles long, and it flows down through Lake Berryessa past Monticello Dam, and then it comes out of the mountains near Winters to flow out across the valley floor and then ends up in the Yolo bypass. So the preserve I described to you was not always like this. Let me tell you a little bit more of the history of what's happened with this creek over time. What did the valley look like in like pre-settlement days? This is a map from 1887. So okay, there had been settlement for about 40 years or so, but it was a map that showed the lands regularly inundated in the valley every winter. You'll see picture there's Sacramento on the upper right here, Davis. This grayish area is the area that would just regularly flood. People trying to go to Sacramento during the wintertime had to do this great big sweep around the Tules to find a way in from the north to get to Sacramento. The other thing that's interesting about Putah Creek and other creeks in the valley is that even though you see on the map today sort of a straight line that kind of comes out of the mountains and goes to the Yolo Basin, it's actually an alluvial fan. If you look at the old channels over geologic time, this is the areas in blue is where the creek has been flowing. It's still, you can see these channels across the landscape. They're fairly small, but they show up on topo maps. And this is the pattern of Putah Creek over geologic time. You can see at some point it actually flowed down west of Dixon, and it's built up this large light gray area that was not very well flooded. It's above the flood zones. This has so much sediment here. There's actually, yeah, so it's this is what the creek looks like over geologic time. The people who the original inhabitants of this area were the Patwin people. They used the creek for a lot of different purposes. This was their source of food, fiber, shelter. They used tules along the way to build canoes. They used deer grass, white root sedge to make baskets. But they didn't just hunt and gather on the land. They actually actively farmed this landscape. And this is a image from just last weekend. The Yochadihi people were demonstrating cultural burning of how they would remove thatch from the grass that would build up. They would cut back shoots. They were actively farming their landscape. And I thought it was really great that the city acknowledged this, and one of the interpretive signs that you'll see out there talks about the Patwin and how they lived on this land, and how they still honor that land. Talks about their land management practices, and this was a collaborative effort with the Yochadihi to make this sign. And the title of it, Fields of Abundance, an Ancient Supermarket, this is what the Yochadihi people described as the land as. It was their supermarket. They would go there for supplies. Unfortunately, by the 1830s, a lot of the Patwin people were gone. They had been either killed, they had been taken by the missions, they were dead from disease. So the early settlers that came into the valley were in a land that was fairly unpopulated. A lot of people came in for mining in the gold fields, but the smart ones actually started farming in the valley. These are some images of what the valley floor looked like around the 1850s, 1860s. The upper image is one of R.E. Moore's ranch up by Woodland. I believe this area coming out of the mountains is Cache Creek. So it shows you some of the vegetation that looked like there. This is the Childs Ranch, in Davis, and shows some of the scattered oak woodlands. And this is the Yolo Audubon Society. This is a in the 1850s, the U.S. passed a Swamplands Act, and they said basically, if you can, we'll sell you land cheap if you can drain it and farm it. And like hundreds of people moved into the valley. They moved into along Putah Creek. They moved down into the Yolo Basin, were farming. The land became really famous for barley farming. And here's an image of some of the barley farming that was going on. But there was like major flooding that still happened and hit this area frequently because it was an inland sea. Here's an image of the Great Flood 1862 in downtown Sacramento. This flooding prevented a lot of people from being successful in farming here, and a number of them just forfeited or left the area. This is an image from a flood a few years ago showing the Sutter Buttes, but it gives you a visual of what that inland sea would look like, flooded during these winter floods. Well, there was a fella who owned some land east of Davis. Davisville was just starting in the late 1860s. And this guy, R.S. Carey, owned some land in Putah Sinks, and his people gave up. They forfeited their land. They sold. They couldn't handle the floods anymore. He kept buying land, and by the 1868 here, owned 20,000 acres of land in the Putah Sinks. You can see here, this is there's the town of Davis, the area in red. This is land holdings in 1879, when he was the largest landowner here. The problem was Carey kept getting his land flooded, and here was Putah Creek coming right through downtown Davisville and aiming right towards his ranch. And he kept fighting that creek for a long time. And then in 1871, up by where the airport is, the creek, in a major flood, the creek jumped its bank and flowed down a farm road. And it flowed to pretty much on the south side of his lands out there. And this was his opportunity. He decided, the town of Davis was starting to develop. He said, hey, you want to save your town? You help me keep that creek in that south channel. And so they struggled with this for 25 years, and it flooded every 2 to 3 years. And every time they put up levees, they were just destroyed in the next flood. And Carey actually went bankrupt trying to control this creek. But this creek, this channel continued despite their, it still persisted. And I found a great image from 1937, which gave me an idea of what that creek looked like before there were any levees down along Putah Creek, before there was even Monticello Dam. This is a little bit difficult to see because it's a composite image, but you can see Putah Creek is the blue line crossing in the middle. The area in green is the South Fork Reserve. I've sketched in modern Mace Ranch. And to help you see a little bit more, I see all these channels out here. I traced them out. And this is really what the South Fork channel was looking like, even as late as the 1930s. So when it flooded, it just spilled out all over the place. To appreciate how different that is from today, here are those same channels put on a modern satellite image. The red lines are now the current levees, and you can just see that the creek would just go all over the place out there. But people throughout the Sacramento Valley were just really frustrated with the amount of flooding that was going on. And it was finally the floods in 1907 and 1908, back-to-back monster floods, blew out levees everywhere. And finally the feds got involved. The Army Corps of Engineers was finally convinced to build a bypass system to protect Sacramento, which they started around 1915 or so. 1914. Here's an image from the local paper about we're going to have this great new flood control project, which has actually um, come to be. This is a close-up of the flood control system in the area around Davis and Sacramento. Goes all the way up the valley in various places. The dark red, this is West Sacramento, Sacramento on the right side here, Davis on the left. The large blue area is the Yolo bypass, and you can see the levees that went up about 9 miles up Putah Creek. And those levees were built before Monticello Dam was built. So they were planning for higher floodwaters. And it's at South Fork Preserve, those levees are placed about a third of a mile across. It's like 10 times the width of the actual channel. They, let's see if the next picture, let me just go back a little bit here. They used, you'll see the wide areas in the creek, like that near the observation deck. I showed you that picture. Those are basically a gravel borrow pit. They dug in the creek for material to make the levees. That's why you see these patches of large ponds along the creek. The Army Corps, when they put in these levees, they actually permanently directed Putah Creek away from downtown Davis. They sealed the break over by the University Airport, and now the creek only flows in the South Fork. And if you want to find the old North Fork where it used to flow, well, you just take a walk over by the University Arboretum. That's the channel. By the 1950s, so they put in all this flood control structure, and Department of Water Resources was assigned to clear all vegetation along the creek because that was viewed as impeding flood flows. So by the 1950s, either gravel mining, agriculture, or this flood clearing had removed a lot of the riparian vegetation along the creek. So it was getting kind of, there were some limitations here. And then 1957, Monticello Dam was finally completed, creating Lake Berryessa, and that cut off all gravel supply downstream, which salmon depend on. It cut off all the active floodplain processes that the habitat depends on in the creek. And it also cut off 90% of the salmon spawning habitat upstream. I showed you that map of all the creeks that they used to go up into. And the orange dot down here is where the dam is. It's basically shut off all of that spawning habitat. So the creek, by this time, like the early 60s, the creek was really not valued at all. I mean, it was useful for water, for agriculture, but other people just viewed it as a flood drain. It was a place you could just dump your trash. So it was just not very well appreciated. By the end of the 80s, finally, two members of Yolo Audubon, Steve Cheney and Susan Sanders, and formed a small subcommittee of Yolo Audubon and said, hey, we should do some cleanup along the creek here. This is an image of what I call the founders and friends of Putah Creek Council. It was taken just last year. But it shows a lot of people that were very instrumental in helping save the creek over the last 35 years. They started out as we just want to clean up the creek. But then year after they started, the creek dried up completely. It was the third year of a drought. The irrigation district invoked a dry release schedule, and they just turned off the creek. First people to notice it, believe it or not, were the kids at Putah Creek, at Camp Putah. Camp Putah's along the creek. They used to swim and canoe and have a good time in the creek, and suddenly there are, there's no water. There's dead fish flopping in the creek, and they came home to mom and dad and said, hey, what's going on? And that Putah Creek Council suddenly had no creek to deal with. But they stepped right up, and first thing they did, they used their newsletters to alert the people, alert the public that the creek had dried up. Um, my wife reminded me that back then I actually wrote to the state water board alerting them about the creek drying up. And Putah Creek Council with the city and UC Davis jumped right in and bought emergency water flows to keep water in the creek. Because the water, really, most of the water in Putah Creek is diverted up at Solano Diversion Dam of winters and goes to Solano County and Fairfield. There's, I think only the city and the university have water rights down below. So that the next year, the creek went dry again, and the Putah Creek Council, University, and the city said, "Hey, this is crazy," and they actually filed a lawsuit against Solano County Water Agency and the Irrigation District. It's a public trust lawsuit, basically saying, "Yeah, we may not have rights to the water, but this is a public trust. The creek belongs to everybody." This is sort of same time that the Mono Lake decision was being worked on. And the Irrigation District really didn't know what they had stirred up. And Putah Creek Council was able to recruit some really top talented people in Davis. Professional hydrologists, professional negotiators, Peter Moyle, leading fishery ecologists. They were all willing to work for free for a good cause. And that started a 10-year battle to save the creek. So it really became a historic settlement about keeping water in a creek. By 2000, they had established the Putah Creek Accord. This was the final results of the lawsuit. There were now guaranteed water flows for steelhead, salmon, for resident native fish, and for downstream landowners who had water rights. It provided some fixed water cutbacks so that during extended droughts, fish and farmers would pay the pain. Provided annual funding for monitoring and a stream keeper. And it established an oversight group, the Lower Putah Creek Coordinating Committee, still active today, to make sure that this decision was fully implemented. And the people were well aware. I mean, they could work together with all these different landowners. They had representatives from Solano County and Yolo County. I think they're really cool because in 2013, what was the results of this accord? Okay, it's a legal decision, but you had then cooperation with the farm owners, with the Solano County Water Agency. You had Putah Creek Council doing a lot of restoration activity in various places along the creek. And in 2013, salmon came back to Putah Creek after a 70-year absence. We're only about 8 salmon that year, but in 2016, there were about 1,500 salmon that came up. And now Winters, always ready for a party, has an annual Winters Salmon Festival. This was the one that just happened last weekend or so, or a week and a half ago. So while this battle for the creek is raging, the city of Davis was actively protecting land along the creek, and they're protecting it at South Fork Preserve. In 1993, the city bought 183 acres of land. This land had been farmed for over 120 years. Surprising that those big trees that I showed you earlier were still there. The one surprising benefit of having a dam upstream was that the down here in the floodway, the state flood board really restricts what happens in a flood in a designated floodway, because it doesn't want to impede any floodwaters from going through. So that means when you try to put in structures or even trees, that could impede the floodwaters. But here, because the Army Corps had put up these levees a third of a mile across, that gave a lot of room for riparian restoration because it would never get maxed out. The dam regulated so much more of it that it provides the room for doing the riparian restoration downstream. The city, purchasing this was really the beginning of a big investment, a long-term investment by the city. And in 1995, this is a satellite image from 1993. You can see on the left side is Mace Boulevard. There's the creek going across the middle here. The city did, in 1995, they did some restoration on the north side of the channel, but then they collaborated with the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps was looking for a project to kind of do some nice things along the rivers and streams of the valley, and the city got $1.8 million in federal grants to do restoration at the South Fork. And this is an image of what that looked like before they started, about the same time that the city bought the land. It's a tomato field with some fairly minimal trees. Even though they started the restoration in 1996, they didn't really get to finish it and open it to public until about 2003. In the meantime, they planted the tomato field with oaks for a woodland. They removed invasive species. They did more planting. You can see in the upper left corner, this is some of the planting that they had done. They created a parking lot and an education. Well, actually, the maintenance roads is what they put in. And a few years later, state parks came in and helped with a kiosk, educational park. So this is what it looked like in 2005. Here's what it looks like today. This is the, you can see how much more, you can see the oak woodland in the lower part of this, the southern part of the preserve, really filling in nicely. It's filling in the riparian areas, fleshing out nicely. This is just really within 30 years, you're having a much more well-developed floodplain habitat. I think that's really cool that you can do that within 30 years. The city also bought land on the west side, about 10 acres over here. And in 2016, they matched some state park money to do public access improvements in the creek. And that actually really didn't have, because of permitting and all kinds of stuff, all that work for public access improvements did not really get finished until this year. And that's what the new improvements are. Anyhow, just tremendous improvement over 30 years. So May of this year, we had a great grand opening of the preserve. Got to show off the new wheelchair accessible trails, the observation deck. There's an new improved single track trail. I told you about these interpretive signs that are out there. But this one thing I learned in my career working with habitat conservation is that just because you buy the land, your protection is not done. Habitat protection is really never done. There's always going to be long-term management and monitoring. And people say, well, why do you have to do it? It's natural. It's not natural anymore. You always have to look for, say, fish passage barriers. You have to make sure the fish are coming up the creek. The big issue is invasive species. Here's a picture of some tamarisk along the creek there. There's a bunch of different invasives. Actually, this preserve is not as bad as some riparian areas I've seen. But there's, Eurasian milfoil in the creek. There's aquatic weeds. There's upland weeds. There are introduced fish species, about 26 different fish species out there that are competing with the native fish. There's introduced clams and mussels. I've You can find Asian clam shells in various places after a flood. So it's just a real ongoing issue. The city has a great interpreter sign out there about this particular issue and how there's a need to do an integrated pest management. That it's you need a lot of different kind of tools to manage these. There's also another ongoing management issue up there is you're on the bottom end of a creek that just people are dumping stuff upstream still. And there's all this trash that keeps moving through. I found one time just up from the preserve, it's just waiting for this refrigerator to come through. So, especially when you're trying to manage an area for public access, this kind of floods can run havoc with your trails. You have to get people out there to clear the trails, and you have to have cleanup. It's still cleanup dates. I mean, that's what Putah Creek Council started with, but the trash is still there. And one of the other issues are visitors. It's really great to have visitors out there. That's one of the reasons the city's investing so much money. And this was a fun little piece of graffiti down underneath Mace Boulevard Bridge. One of the big issues, though, the challenges with some of the visitors is that people will start fires out there. I've seen multiple fire rings in various places around the reserve. If you come out there in August, September, with all that dry grass, one match can just take that out, take all of that stuff out. So it's always, how do you manage that? Well, you only have limited staff. People come out at all kinds of different times, hours of the day. It's pretty hard to do, but it is an ongoing issue. Which brings me back, sort of getting close to the end of my story here, is that there's lots of room for volunteers to help out. And this is a collaborative Putah Creek Council volunteer effort with the city doing some planting out at the preserve. The city is always looking for people they have a Wednesday Weed Warriors or Weed Whackers program now, I think they call it. They're looking for volunteers. The city wildlife biologist John McNerney, a bunch of you know, looks for volunteers with nest box surveys. Putah Creek Council is doing restoration planting up and down the creek. So there's lots of opportunities for people to get out and help out. As I said, this is an ongoing issue of managing these lands. You just don't walk away from it. It doesn't take care of it by itself. So anyhow, that's kind of where I want to wrap it up here. I've sort of described the preserve for you, gave you an idea of what a great ecological treasure it is, some of my favorite spots out there. We're having much more of a thriving creek than we had if you look at those images from the 50s, right? And the success along Putah Creek, I don't fully appreciate the statewide or larger implication of it, but recently a group down along the Kern River that's called Bring Back the Kern, they're interested in trying to bring back 15 miles of dry creek bed that flows through Bakersfield. And they saw the Putah Creek success story and they said, we need to learn from you guys. So they had this Zoom presentation just about 3 or 4 weeks ago in which they invited people from Putah Creek to say, hey, how did you guys do that? How can we do that here? So it's a great template that others are borrowing from. And I think it's a great conservation success. And just encourage you to all get out there. And if you guys are interested, I'd be glad to lead a walk out there. Just let me know about it. So with that, I'll just sort of wrap it up, and I'll have Kent give me, handle questions and answers.
Thank you, Mark, for that history of Putah Creek and all of the efforts leading up to the creation of the preserve. A lot of new information for me. We do have a question in the chat. Carlos wants to know what kind of wildlife uses the habitat of the preserve.
What kind of wildlife is out there?
Yes.
Well, a bunch of your the Audubon folks will know the birds a lot better than I do. Um, but the oak woodland is a great spot for Swainson's hawks. Yolo and Solano County is one of the concentration areas of breeding Swainson's hawks in California, and they love that open woodland area. So you'll see Swainson's hawks flying out there as well as other hawks. Um, there's rabbit trails all over the place out there, and deer tracks. I've seen otters swimming in the creek. There's egrets, great blue herons. There's a whole nest of or a roost of turkey vultures that frequent one area, and there's let's see from I think that sort of covers it. I think that your other members will bird watchers that are better than I would be able to tell you what you can see out there.
I would imagine nocturnal animals, raccoon, possum, various different types of rodents. Probably gray fox.
There's a
Now,
lot of scat all over the place. I
years
try to
ago,
get the. Go ahead.
years ago, there was a sign talking about look out for mountain lions. Has one ever been spotted out there?
I don't think they've been spotted right there at the preserve, but they have been spotted down um, along the creek. Bear have come down the creek. Remember that story about the bear running around Davis a
Right.
few years ago? This is Putah Creek is a wildlife corridor. It's you're a way for it's a protected cover all the way from the hills down into the Yola Basin, and it doesn't surprise me. You got mountain lions and black bear using that.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if it's probably the source of our beloved turkeys in town. Um,
All right.
there was another question about, are there opportunities to expand the preserve by purchasing more land?
Yeah, there is, and I have. So I spent 12 years on the City Open Space Commission, doing a bunch of different things. But one vision I created while I was there was like, wouldn't it be something to have a walking path along Putah Creek from the old Davis Road, where the Hawk, um, what do you call that? Hawk Center up there, the Raptor Center, um, all the way down along the creek to Mace Boulevard. And there's still riparian vegetation along the way. One of the challenges is that um, the land is all privately owned, and those landowners have parcels that are very linear. They have just a small amount, sort of narrow strip, with a place to tap into water from the creek, and then land to the south or north to do their farming. So you don't necessarily need to buy all of that land, but it's one parcel. So how can you? Is there a way you could work with those landowners to accommodate public access just within the levee part of that to allow a trail to be um, formed along the creek there? I think it'd be. I think there's probably some money out there. I did some analysis that if you look at current agricultural prices, you can actually buy up that land between both of those roads for like $1 million. And really, in conservation speaking, that's not that much. It's just a matter of getting the landowners to be willing to parcel up and to not threaten their access to water for their crops.
Right. Yeah, I think trying to negotiate some easements for public access, brings along with it the risk of, like you mentioned earlier, trashing the place out. And landowners really don't want that trash on their property.
It's and yeah, they don't want it. So if they're going to sell an easement with public access, those are usually about the same price as buying all of the rights for the land.
Wow.
So because it brings with it a lot of problems for landowners.
Okay. Um, the next question talks about beavers and salmon. Are there beaver management plans to stop salmon are there beaver management plans to stop the dams from keeping the salmon from going up for spawning?
I don't know if there's any management plans. I know that the stream keeper will go out occasionally and remove um, beaver dams in places. Often, when the salmon are coming upriver, um, they're doing that when there's enough flow coming through the down the creek that can push out those beaver dams. Because you need
Uh-huh.
enough water to actually reach down into the tow drain into the in the Yellow Basin for the salmon to come up.
Yeah.
So it's often not a problem. The beaver dams build up from the winter through the summer because there's lower flow and they can persist out there. And that's when people are out there at the creek. They say, "Oh, the big beaver dam," but um, I haven't heard of any plans to actually remove those beaver dams.
Okay. Here is a long one, or maybe it's a statement. There's trash all over along the levee between the Raptor Center and Mace Way. It's managed right now. Even a nasty dead horse carcass right at the edge of the creek. Also, people camp along there. It might be better if there was a public easement with some sort of oversight than the way it is now. So that was just a statement by one of the members.
Yeah, actually, one of the even though some people are maybe a little concerned about visitors, one of the value of having visitors out there is just more eyes on the land, and people can report the problem so that the city or the county or whoever has the land can go out and manage that. Um, the parking lot at South Fork Preserve used to be separated from Mace Boulevard by some heavy, dense trees that had cover all the way down to the ground level. That provided protection for people to go in there with their trailers and campers, and they were camping in the parking lot because they were not visible from the street. The city went in and cleared all the vegetation up to about 10 feet above the ground, and now it's completely visible for people driving along Mace Boulevard. And there has not been a problem with people camping in there more. It's just too exposed. So there's value of having more people out in these areas to report that and try to keep people taking care of the land.
Okay, there's another question like, was there some sort of a celebration when those 8 salmon came up the river and up the creek in 2013?
Oh, there was a celebration. Well, it was nobody was really in that year. We were not necessarily sure it was going to happen, but then people started to see it, and then I was among the bunch of people that ran out there in various places to see them swimming up the creek. It was really exciting. I think that really triggered the development of the Winter Salmon Festival, but I don't remember if there was like a formal event. I don't think there was enough time to organize things, and
Uh-huh.
really we didn't quite expect that it was going to happen so well. And it's it's 8 salmon, but to see in subsequent years the improvement over time is just really neat.
Okay, great. Let's see. We ran out. Okay, there's no more questions. Um, last chance, folks. Oh, okay, here we go. Oh, keep moving. Okay, there we go. After 70 years of no salmon, how did they find their way? Isn't it due to sense of smell?
It is, yeah. And that is a remarkable question. It's like, how did they do this? Because there was no um, generational information being passed. Um, and I don't fully understand how that works. But the the trick for attracting those salmon is this really tightly coordinated process of the the dam operators need to have like a 5 to 7 day pulse of flow higher than normal. You can go out there, I think it's in October when they do this. You can see the creek suddenly goes up about a foot or so. And that's the pulse of water that's pushing that Putah flavored water all the way down into the Yellow Basin and down the tow drain, hitting down towards the delta. And the fish around there can just smell it and they just follow it all the way up. They also have to, once they get up there, the other timing is that the farmers have different things they do along Lower Putah Creek. For example, Road 106A is a farm access road. They fill the creek with dirt and they drive back and forth across it with their tractors. It's not a problem when the creek is not really flowing much and there's no salmon coming up. But just about the time that you do that pulse of water, they take out the road, so there's no blockage for the fish to get up. They take out a check dam down lower in the bypass. So all this has to be timed fairly carefully to allow the fish getting up. This year, interestingly, the new streamkeeper, Max Stevenson, found a way to put in a better culvert under that Road 106A, and so they don't have to take the road out as early, gives them still access across the creek, and salmon are up there in winters right now.
Great. Okay, there are folks who are thanking you for a great talk, as do I. And I was reminded here by a statement, and I want to make an announcement that the recording of tonight's program will be uploaded to the Yolo Audubon YouTube channel in a couple of days. Hopefully this week. So anyway, if you wanted to see this again or tell some friends about it, it will be on the Yolo Audubon YouTube channel. Okay. All right, folks, we're going to last call for questions. Okay, Mark, a lot of people are thanking you for this, and really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight. It's I think very interesting information about the history of the creek and how we got that. I mean, just the development of the preserve, so that all of us could enjoy it. Pretty cool.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I encourage you to get out there. These new interpretive signs cover a lot of the points I was just talking about. So you can bring family, friends out there to see it in person, to learn the story in a slightly different way. And I think it's just a great story. I'm pretty excited about it. I'm glad there were so many people online on the Zoom session tonight. And yeah, like I said, if you want to get a walk out there, just let me know.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Fantastic.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Folks, thank you for coming tonight. And I'm going to close the meeting now. And have a great rest of your evening.